Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting back, not just to any ordinary time, but to one of those strangely quiet moments in history when the streets of towns and villages were emptied almost overnight. The plague had come, of course, because humanity always finds a way to make things worse. And those who survived, well, they had a curious sort of loneliness, the kind that wasn't just absence of people but the absence of certainty. It was a silence so complete, you could almost hear your own heartbeat bouncing off the empty rooftops. Imagine waking up in a village where half your neighbors were gone, half of your family too, and even the dogs seemed to sniff at you differently, like they could sense that something fundamental had shifted. These survivors often had no one left to argue with, no one to celebrate with, no one to glance at suspiciously while you tried to look busy. And naturally, their minds, previously accustomed to the small dramas of domestic life, petty arguments about stolen bread, the Lord's odd fashions, now turned inward. Let's meet one such survivor, though history doesn't often give them names. Let's call him Bernard. Bernard was an ordinary man with extraordinarily bad timing. He lived in a small European town somewhere damp and cold, probably in the 14th century, and like many, he had been spared by the plague. He didn't know why. Perhaps he had the simplest constitution, or perhaps he had been the sort to avoid his neighbors entirely, which in retrospect was excellent plague survival strategy. But his survival came at a cost. Because Bernard was alive, the town looked at him with suspicion. Not that they could really look at him, since they were mostly gone. Still, in those rare moments when a traveling merchant appeared, eyes narrowed at the sight of Bernard, trying to decide if he was a ghost, a harbinger, or just a man who had inexplicably worn clean clothes in a town where no one bothered to wash anything anymore. Bernard became a symbol, not intentionally and certainly not honorably. The plague had made him an icon of endurance and also of profoundly awkward social timing. He wandered empty streets, which, in the days before streetlights, were already quite dark, carrying the faint smell of smoke and death. Every creaking door, every fluttering shutter seemed to echo a question. Why him? Of course, he had no answer. The nearest priest had died of the disease. The mayor, also dead, had left no guidance. Survival was no longer just about finding food or avoiding illness. It had become a moral and existential exercise, and Bernard was thoroughly unprepared. As days turned into weeks, Bernard learned the curious habits of the lonely. He started talking to birds, because silence was too much for a human mind. The birds, mostly indifferent, sometimes seemed to reply, and he pretended they were wise old friends offering counsel. He developed a fascination with cobblestones, counting each one as if some hidden significance rested there. And he found an unusual pleasure in tracing the patterns of lichen on walls, imagining that nature, at least, had not judged him for being alive. History has little patience for people like Bernard. Chroniclers would later note, in passing, that many fled or died, and perhaps a few paragraphs later, they might list the grand names of kings or generals, leaving Bernard's quiet, sorrowful survival entirely unremarked. And yet, his experience, monotonous, tedious, and strangely beautiful in its emptiness, is, in many ways, more historically revealing than any battle or coronation. It tells us about endurance, about human fragility, about the profound loneliness that can accompany survival when everyone else has been claimed by forces beyond reason. Interestingly, some survivors did not handle the isolation well. Bernard, for instance, started keeping meticulous journals of the dead, noting who had succumbed and who hadn't. This was not morbid curiosity in a casual sense, but a desperate effort to impose order on chaos. He even invented minor rituals, such as bowing to each street corner or offering a piece of bread to an empty house. These acts were, naturally, meaningless to anyone else. There was no one else, but they gave him the illusion of social engagement, which, after months of empty streets and silent markets, became essential. And yet, life had a gentle way of reminding Bernard that he was still alive. The sun would rise, unbothered by the loss of townsfolk. Rain would fall, washing streets that no longer carried the sound of children's feet. Animals would forage, indifferent to the plague's toll. Even this quiet persistence was, in its own way, comforting. Nature had not abandoned him. Only humans had, which is perhaps worse. Let's drift over to the next layer of this loneliness: fear. Bernard had survived the plague, yes, but survival was not merely living. It was carrying forward a weight, a faint guilt. He could not help but notice the absence of friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances. Every face missing from the tavern's doorway, every door left swinging in the wind, reminded him that life had moved on without them. And human minds, as we know, are quite good at manufacturing companions when none exist, especially when those companions are dead or gone. Bernard, in some ways, was never alone. He was surrounded by ghosts, polite or indifferent, who never asked him to explain anything. We could consider this survival as a kind of royal misfortune, albeit a democratic one. Bernard was his own small kingdom, his streets his fiefdom, his empty home a court of silence. He ruled nothing but the echoes of those who had perished, and naturally, he made policies accordingly. He might have decreed, in his head, that bread be rationed carefully, that stray cats be permitted entry to abandoned houses, that no unnecessary noise be made, lest to disturb the spirits lingering like faint shadows. And so, he became both monarch and servant, caretaker and mourner, audience and performer. The interesting aspect here is that this kind of isolation sharpens human observation. Bernard became intimately familiar with what had once been ordinary: the texture of fabric, the smell of stale bread, the slow decay of wooden shutters. Each moment, each sound, each shift of light became a story. Perhaps he never intended it to be, but in surviving the plague, he became a chronicler of absence, a historian of what had been lost, and yet, paradoxically, a witness to persistence. Naturally, he wasn't the only one. Many survivors, scattered across Europe, shared similar experiences. Some went mad, whispering to walls. Others turned to obsessive cataloging of property or livestock, trying to assert order on a world that had shown it could vanish without warning. A few, like Bernard, found solace in nature and small rituals. And all of them, without exception, learned that survival is rarely celebratory. It is quiet, unremarkable, and sometimes unbearably lonely. We might imagine Bernard in his small house, preparing a meager meal by candlelight, listening to the wind moan through broken windows. He would perhaps trace the pattern of the flames, humming softly to himself. Outside, the streets remained empty. The town, once noisy and inconvenient, now existed only in memory and faint echo. And Bernard, for all his solitude, adapted. Not gloriously, not heroically, but quietly, persistently, humanly. Everything else has vanished. A reminder that history is as much about those who endure in silence as those who achieve loudly. So, when we speak of survival in history, it is worth remembering that it is rarely about triumph. It is about continuing in the absence of audience or applause, about noticing the tiny details, about finding meaning in the smallest things. Bernard, in his quiet, ghost-haunted life, represents this perfectly. He survived, and in surviving, he bore witness. And sometimes that is enough. Let's linger a moment on the peculiar adjustments he made. Bernard began to sleep differently, waking only with the sun and avoiding dreams too vivid, for fear they would remind him of lost companions. He collected small objects, pebbles, feathers, broken pottery shards, not for art, but as anchors, tangible reminders that he could interact with the world, however minimally. And he whispered, often, to no one, recounting stories from days past, practicing conversation like a musician tuning an instrument that no longer had an audience. Over time, Bernard became a fixture of local folklore. Travelers might mention a quiet man in a deserted village, muttering to the walls and feeding birds from his hand. They would speculate, of course, about curses or spirits, but the truth was simpler. He was alive, painfully aware of his survival, and desperately attempting to preserve some connection to a world that had mostly disappeared. And so, we drift with Bernard, through empty streets, quiet meals, whispered stories, and careful observation. He embodies the oddity of being present when. As we continue to wander through the quiet aftermath of the plague, let's imagine, alongside Bernard, the rest of a half-empty town. Streets that once bustled with merchants shouting over the clatter of horses and carts are now softened into a kind of perpetual twilight. The shops stand open, wares still on shelves, as if the proprietors simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. It is a world paused, waiting politely for someone to come back and resume the chaos. Into this silence wandered other survivors, each developing their own peculiar routines. Take, for instance, Lady Marguerite, or perhaps, to preserve her anonymity, Madame M. She survived in a manor house far too large for one person, because naturally, her family, one by one, had succumbed to the disease. She became obsessed with cleanliness, which, before the plague, had been something of a mild suggestion among her peers. Now, she polished floors until her hands bled and rearranged her silverware in complex patterns that no one could appreciate but her. The house, which once rang with laughter and minor quarrels, became a museum of obsessive order. Madame M spoke to her cats as if they were distant relatives, and she would leave notes on the tables, addressed to ghosts she hoped might someday return. Of course, the ghosts never returned, but she persisted. And in her quiet, meticulous routines, we can see the strange psychology of survival, the human mind's desperate attempt to assert control when the world itself has been so thoroughly chaotic. Back in the town square, Bernard's own routines intersected, indirectly, with other survivors. There was the baker, who, after losing his apprentices and family, began shaping bread into little effigies of the dead. He didn't eat most of them. He arranged them on shelves, as if the act of creating them could somehow replace human conversation. A merchant, once loud and boastful, now wandered silently with a basket of unsold linens, nodding faintly to no one, murmuring half-formed sentences to the empty air. One begins to notice, in these quiet towns, a peculiar shift in time. Without neighbors to call to, without festivals or fairs to observe, days stretched endlessly. People like Bernard and Madame Mem began waking according to the sun, sleeping according to the shadows, and measuring weeks not in events, but in the subtle changes in weather or the slow decay of objects. A broken cart wheel, a rotting fence post, the gentle swelling of lichen. All these became markers of continuity, small reminders that, at least, the world had not completely vanished. Let's pause briefly to consider the social consequences of such isolation. Survivors were, paradoxically, both liberated and burdened. With the old rules gone, no town council, no tax collector, no neighbors to judge their clothing. They could technically do as they pleased. And yet, the absence of anyone to witness their choices made every action feel oddly performative, as if the universe itself were a quiet, indifferent audience. Madame M polished silver for weeks, Bernard counted cobblestones, and the baker arranged bread effigies. They were exercising tiny dominions over nothing, and yet, it mattered to them. Some survivors formed what could politely be called alliances of convenience. Two distant households might trade supplies, exchanging bread for firewood in a silent negotiation that could stretch weeks, simply because no one was in a hurry. Meetings took place outdoors, under trees, to avoid any lingering sense of contagion, and were conducted with an awkward courtesy that seems almost unreal to us now. They did not argue, they barely spoke. And when they did, it was often about trivialities, because deeper conversations carried too much weight in a world where everyone else was gone. It is worth noting, as we drift further into this quiet, that the plague did not merely remove people, it reshaped etiquette, habit, and even imagination. Survivors invented games and distractions that, to outsiders, might appear absurd. A noblewoman might play chess alone, assigning voices to the pieces and report the outcomes in her diary. A merchant might speak in riddles to the stray dogs who followed him around. And Bernard, of course, continued his conversations with birds who, politely or not, never disagreed. There were also, naturally, moments of minor misfortune, because human beings do not entirely avoid absurdity, even when alone. A survivor might lock themselves out of their own house and spend an entire afternoon wandering in despair, or accidentally set fire to a pile of papers, consisting mostly of meticulously catalogued belongings and letters to the dead. And yet, these small tragedies seemed almost gentle, in contrast to the grand catastrophe that had just swept through the region. Misfortune, once personal, now felt quiet, almost quaint. Let's drift now to one of the more unusual social adaptations: ritualized remembrance. Survivors often held private ceremonies, small, improvised, and entirely self-directed. They would light candles for absent neighbors, whisper the names of family members, or leave flowers in doorways where children had once lived. These acts, which might seem somber, were often performed with a delicate humor, a tiny self-deprecating acknowledgement that life continued, despite everything. And sometimes, the act of ritual itself became entertainment, repetition providing comfort, structure, and a sense of participation in the world that had gone strangely silent. Bernard, for example, began to incorporate small ceremonies into his daily routines. He would bow slightly to the empty town square at dawn, leave crumbs for birds, and tap the walls gently with a stick, as if communicating in a language only he and the ghosts could understand. These gestures may seem strange to us, but they are a natural human response to isolation, a quiet insistence that existence still matters, even when the audience is gone. Even in such desolation, human curiosity remained intact. Survivors wandered further afield than they ever would have before. Bernard might venture to the outskirts of town to inspect the abandoned mills, imagining the lives of millers who no longer existed. Madame Anne might stroll along the overgrown paths of her garden, cataloging plants as though writing a botanical encyclopedia for an audience of squirrels. They observed patterns, created small systems, and clung to the familiar in a world that had been uprooted. And yet, the plague left lasting psychological traces. Survivors often exhibited peculiar behaviors, hoarding supplies, avoiding crowded spaces even when towns slowly repopulate, or speaking in quiet tones, as though raising one's voice might anger fate itself. They became, in some ways, philosophers of absence, meditating on impermanence without ever needing to articulate it fully. In the quiet streets, with the echo of a distant bell or a cawing crow, they learned patience, endurance, and the gentle art of waiting. Of course, not all adaptations were practical. Some survivors developed elaborate cleaning routines, scrubbing surfaces obsessively while ignoring the more pressing concerns of food or warmth. Others created elaborate narratives to explain why they alone had survived. Perhaps Bernard believed it was his careful counting of cobblestones, Madame M, her extreme tidiness. It hardly mattered. Humans are rarely satisfied with mere luck. Explanation, even an imaginary one, brings comfort. As we linger on these quiet vignettes, it becomes clear that survival was both mundane and extraordinary. There was no triumphal march, no heroic narrative, just the slow, rhythmic continuation of life in empty towns and abandoned homes. Survivors were guardians of memory, caretakers of absence, chroniclers of the vanished. And in their quiet persistence, we can see a strange beauty, a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and even find subtle amusement in one's own solitary routines. As we linger in the shadowed streets and empty squares, let's imagine the few survivors beginning to notice each other, not in the bustling, ordinary sense, but with cautious curiosity, like shy animals emerging after a long winter. There was Bernard, of course, counting cobblestones and conversing with birds, and Madame M, polishing silver and narrating the lives of absent relatives to cats. And now, over the course of slow weeks and quiet months, others began to appear. Distant cousins, wandering tradespeople, or a priest who had somehow avoided the disease by living in constant mild paranoia. Interactions were strange at first. People had forgotten the rhythms of ordinary society. A handshake, a smile, even a simple greeting carried an almost absurd weight, as if touching another person required careful negotiation. Conversations started hesitantly, with long pauses, as each party gauged whether the other had somehow gone slightly mad, or worse, carried an unpleasant habit like speaking too loudly or laughing at inappropriate moments. Some survivors formed tiny, fragile alliances. Two households might share firewood or trade small stores of food. But even these exchanges were slow, awkward, and ritualized. Meetings occurred at a precise distance, with gestures and bows that seemed like formalities drawn from an imagined code of etiquette. The survivors treated each interaction with exaggerated caution because they had learned that chaos could arrive suddenly, and often did, in the form of disease, misfortune, or minor misunderstandings. One cannot discuss this period without acknowledging the minor absurdities that emerged. Take, for example, a widowed merchant who began to narrate his life as if it were a grand historical epic, addressing imaginary audiences of ghosts and birds alike. Or a seamstress who, having lost her apprentices and clientele, practiced embroidery obsessively, producing intricate works with no recipient. These were not eccentricities born of malice, but of necessity. When the ordinary world disappears, humans naturally invent new ones, populated with rules, rituals, and imaginary spectators. It is fascinating to note that survivors often gravitated toward forms of entertainment and distraction that were entirely solitary. Chess became a performance. Each piece was assigned a distinct personality and backstory. Walking through the streets, one might overhear a solitary figure muttering dramatic monologues directed at a stray dog or a fluttering leaf. Bernard himself began cataloging minor events, like the exact number of birds feeding in the square or the patterns of light across the cobblestones, as if the world's order depended on careful record-keeping. Yet, despite the peculiarities, there was a gentle rhythm to their lives. Survivors learned the subtle art of pacing. Meals were simple and deliberate. Tasks were repeated, not from necessity, but from a quiet understanding that repetition itself was comforting. They observed nature in ways they had never done before: the slow bloom of flowers, the migration of birds, the quiet decay of wood and stone. In this attentiveness, they found a kind of solace, proof that life, stubborn and indifferent, persisted. Occasionally, the odd social faux pas would remind them that humanity, even in sparse numbers, retains its absurdity. Someone might knock on a door expecting a neighbor to answer, only to remember, with a faint sigh, that the house had been empty for months. Or two survivors might attempt conversation, each speaking simultaneously, resulting in a quiet cacophony that left both participants slightly embarrassed. These moments, minor and unremarkable, served as reminders that the world had not entirely lost its humor, just its audience. In some villages, survivors created strange micro-societies, governed not by law or tradition, but by habit and whimsy. They would assign themselves small offices, one person responsible for sweeping, another for keeping track of time using sundials or shadows. Occasionally, they held miniature ceremonies, lighting candles for absent neighbors or leaving small tokens of remembrance in doorways. These rituals, simultaneously practical and ceremonial, allowed survivors to maintain a sense of connection, however faint, to the vanished population. We can also observe the subtle psychological consequences of this prolonged solitude. Survivors often became hyper-aware of absence. Empty chairs, unlit windows, and shuttered doors carried disproportionate significance. A slight movement in a field, the rustle of leaves, or the distant barking of a dog could trigger elaborate narratives in the mind. In some ways, these people became historians of absence, chronicling not only what remained but what had disappeared. Their diaries, when they existed, read as a blend of natural observation, philosophical musing, and gentle humor, a record of the quiet persistence of life in the face of pervasive loss. Let's pause to consider one particularly gentle absurdity: the obsession with minor details. Survivors often took to cataloging small, mundane elements of their environment. The exact number of bricks in a chimney, the shape of a cloud, or the arrangement of stones in a garden became subjects of intense scrutiny. This was not mere eccentricity. It was a method of exerting control in a world that had been abruptly ungoverned. And, naturally, it had a soothing, meditative quality, allowing the mind to linger on patterns and order rather than chaos and death. As weeks turned into months, new routines emerged, blending necessity, comfort, and amusement. People learned to walk long distances alone without anxiety, to carry food carefully, to listen to birds or the wind as companions. There was a strange dignity in this careful adaptation. Survivors were small monarchs of their territories, rulers of empty streets and quiet homes, accountable only to themselves, the few animals left, and the subtle rhythms of nature. Even the concept of time shifted. With markets closed, schools abandoned, and festivals canceled indefinitely, survivors measured days by shadow and sun, not by bells or proclamations. Each day became both infinite and delicate, a slow procession of tasks, observations, and quiet reflections. Bernard's daily counting of cobblestones was not madness but method, a gentle insistence that life had structure, even when human order had vanished. And so, as the survivors moved through their carefully measured lives, the town itself transformed. Abandoned homes became small gardens, barns slowly collapsed into fields, and streets grew soft with grass. In this process, the survivors' world became less a human city and more a hybrid space, where human memory, natural growth, and small rituals coexisted in delicate balance. They were caretakers not only of objects but of absence, of memory, and of the strange, gentle absurdities that arise when life continues in miniature after catastrophe. As the days turned into months, the survivors began noticing patterns, not just in nature or in their meticulously catalogued belongings, but in each other. The occasional interaction, once novel and tentative, now carried the potential for minor friction. Of course, these conflicts were rarely dramatic. There were no duels or wars, just small irritations, slightly mismatched expectations, and the occasional stubborn insistence that one's own routines were, naturally, the correct ones. Consider, for instance, the case of two survivors sharing a garden. One, a retired shoemaker, had become devoted to arranging stones in precise geometric patterns. The other, a schoolteacher turned herbalist, insisted on leaving plants wherever they happened to grow naturally. Both were polite, of course, but each found the other's habits mildly exasperating. Arguments were whispered, gestures measured, and compromises made, but never without a faint air of resentment, as if the petty annoyances of life refused to disappear simply because the world had mostly emptied. Small disagreements were amplified by the lack of wider distraction. When there was nothing else to observe, every minor annoyance gained disproportionate importance. A stray chicken crossing a carefully raked garden bed could cause hours of internal debate, or a slightly crooked fence post might prompt an entire day's reorganization. Humans, it seems, cannot fully relinquish the need for order, even when their surroundings are largely abandoned and largely indifferent. Yet, alongside the friction, there was an extraordinary gentleness in these interactions. Survivors quickly learned that patience and understatement were essential. Loud voices were frowned upon, quick gestures discouraged, and any overt display of frustration risked a week-long silent treatment. Social rituals emerged organically. Polite bows, soft murmurs of greeting, and the careful distribution of work and responsibility. Each action, however minor, became a means of maintaining fragile harmony in a world without rules, except those invented quietly by necessity or whimsy. Meanwhile, survival required constant adaptation to a slightly absurd reality. Without markets or shops, each person became a jack of all trades. Bernard, for instance, learned to repair shoes, mend clothing, and even attempt minor carpentry, though he lacked any formal training. Madame M turned her obsessive tidiness into practical utility, using her meticulous organizational skills to ration food, preserve supplies, and manage the small communal household. They became self-sufficient, not gloriously or heroically, but pragmatically, with a quiet, understated competence. Animals, too, played subtle roles in the survivors' lives. Cats, dogs, and even birds became confidants, collaborators, and, occasionally, arbiters of minor disputes. A stray cat might receive food as a form of tax or tribute, its attention considered a mark of approval. Birds, in Bernard's case, functioned as observers, critics, and gentle companions. Their presence, small as it was, reminded survivors that the world outside themselves persisted, that life had not entirely abandoned its rhythms, and that silence, while heavy, need not be absolute. One can also notice the ways survivors repurposed architecture and space. Empty barns became workshops, abandoned courtyards transformed into meeting areas, and houses once too large for one person were divided into private quarters, communal areas, and storage. Every object acquired multiple functions. A broom might sweep floors, prop open doors, or serve as a marker in a casual game of strategy involving stones and sticks. Life became an improvisation, structured by necessity, creativity, and subtle humor. And humor naturally persisted, quietly, understatedly, often only half recognized. Survivors developed small, private jokes, the sight of a pigeon perched on a carefully arranged stone pattern, the absurdity of trying to hold a meeting with nobody else to attend, or the faintly theatrical ritual of offering flowers to an empty doorway. These little absurdities, harmless and private, became crucial forms of emotional survival. They reminded humans that, even in desolation, levity remained possible. Occasionally, new arrivals disrupted the delicate balance. A traveling merchant, perhaps uninfected by fear, might enter the town, bringing goods, news, and the unsettling energy of a wider world. Survivors greeted such visitors cautiously, evaluating intentions, habits, and hygiene. Conversations were polite, measured, and occasionally tense, but rarely confrontational. They were exercises in adaptation, subtle negotiation, and careful diplomacy, all performed in hushed tones, with the understanding that too much noise could threaten the fragile equilibrium of daily life. Interestingly, even religion and superstition adapted to the new reality. Churches were largely empty, priests absent, yet rituals persisted in miniature. Survivors might light candles for the dead, recite prayers quietly at dawn, or invent new rituals to mark the passage of time. These practices were often a blend of memory, habit, and private amusement, reflecting both reverence for what had been lost and subtle acknowledgement that survival required flexibility, creativity, and a gentle sense of humor. Over time, small clusters of survivors became quasi-communities, informal alliances that balanced cooperation with independence. One might handle food preparation, another maintain shelter, and a third catalog or record events. There was no strict hierarchy, no grand design, just the tacit understanding that cooperation increased comfort and security. Even minor disagreements were managed politely through gestures, gentle corrections, and, occasionally, the silent negotiation of shared space. Perhaps the most striking feature of these post-plague micro-communities was their attention to detail. Every task, however minor, was performed carefully. Firewood was stacked with precision. Meals were cooked slowly, with attention to flavor and nutrition. Clothes were repaired methodically. And through these repeated, careful actions, the survivors found structure, rhythm, and a quiet dignity in the continuity of life. As the weeks stretched into months, and months into an oddly measured rhythm of survival, we begin to notice the peculiar ways survivors occupied themselves. Without bustling markets, neighbors, or the usual social obligations, every small act assumed a disproportionate significance. A repaired shoe was a triumph. A carefully stacked pile of firewood was a minor festival. And naturally, some survivors became devoted catalogers, chroniclers of the minutiae of a world that no longer required much attention. Bernard, of course, continued his cobblestone counting, but now he added layers: shadows, bird activity, weather patterns, and even the decay of wood on abandoned doors. Each day he recorded, with meticulous care, the slight differences, the minute irregularities that might otherwise escape notice. This practice, part meditation and part obsession, became a way of asserting control over the unpredictable. And control, in a post-plague town, was strangely comforting. Madame M, on the other hand, devoted her cataloging to domestic artifacts. Silver spoons were counted, polished, and cataloged according to weight, design, and minor scratches. Chairs were aligned with geometric precision. Curtains, where they still existed, were inspected daily for dust and light exposure. Each act, repetitive and measured, was a private ritual, a small assertion that the world remained orderly, even when society had disappeared. Other survivors developed similar obsessions, though their focuses were more whimsical. One man recorded the comings and goings of stray cats, noting which windows they favored. A woman cataloged the color variations in her garden over weeks and months, assigning each plant a narrative identity as though they were tiny, living companions. And a merchant, newly arrived, became fascinated with the sound of wind in empty chimneys, noting each variation with quiet delight. The humor here is subtle but persistent. Humans, left largely alone, tend toward absurdity, but the absurdity is rarely aggressive or malicious. It is gentle, private, a survival mechanism disguised as eccentricity. Birds become auditors. Empty rooms demand daily inspection, and walls, silent witnesses to catastrophe, are treated with reverence, suspicion, and occasional complaint. There is a delicate comedy in these interactions, one that unfolds slowly, without urgency, yet with quiet insistence that life must be observed, measured, and respected. It is also worth noting that survivors invented their own minor hierarchies, almost imperceptible, based on competence in the mundane. The best gardener might wield authority over plant placement. The most meticulous cataloger could arbitrate disputes over object arrangement. These hierarchies were rarely enforced by speech. They existed subtly, through gestures, acknowledgement, and tacit respect. They were microcosms of order, reflecting the human need for structure even when the traditional social order had been obliterated. Animals, as ever, played supporting roles. Cats became companions, auditors, and occasionally mischievous disruptors of carefully arranged objects. Birds, in Bernard's case, were his court of advisors. Dogs performed the occasional minor service, though mostly they observed. In all cases, animals provided both distraction and companionship, filling the silent spaces of empty towns with the rhythm of life. The humor of these adaptations is understated, often only noticeable if one pays close attention. A misaligned pile of stones might provoke hours of adjustment. A stray feather could become a significant discovery. A suddenly missing spoon might inspire subtle intrigue or quiet consternation. These small dramas, insignificant in any broader historical sense, were the entire universe of experience for survivors. And, naturally, they were taken seriously because seriousness was comforting in a world that had otherwise discarded expectation. Occasionally, these routines intersected with faint reminders of the wider world. A traveler passing through might inspire cautious observation, polite engagement, and minor performance of competence or civility. Survivors would demonstrate their meticulous cataloging, their careful gardening, their oddly precise domestic arrangements. To outsiders, it might seem obsessive or theatrical, but for those living in quiet isolation, it was essential, a reminder that life retained its structure, its rhythm, and its absurdities, even if the audience was small or imagined. Religion, superstition, and ritual evolved subtly as well. Churches were largely empty, but survivors preserved fragments of liturgy, invented personal prayers, or observed miniature ceremonies in private spaces. Candles were lit for those long gone. Objects were touched reverently, and small offerings made to empty doorways. These practices combined reverence, habit, and subtle amusement. They were acts of memory, acknowledgement, and quiet companionship with absence itself. We can also glimpse the gentle social politics that arose among survivors. Cooperation was valued, but independence respected. Minor disputes over space, objects, or attention were resolved quietly. There were no grand confrontations, just subtle negotiation, polite assertion, and occasional silent withdrawal. Life had become an exercise in restraint, patience, and careful observation, a slow, quiet ballet of human adaptation in a world largely emptied. And so, Bernard and Madame Mem, the retired shoemaker, the wandering merchant, and the quiet herbalist all found their rhythm. They moved through days with quiet deliberation, observing, recording, arranging, and occasionally laughing softly at the private absurdities of their routines. Their survival was not heroic or dramatic. It was persistent, meticulous, and subtly humorous. And in this persistence, we find a gentle, enduring lesson that life, no matter how emptied or absurd, continues quietly, insistently, and sometimes beautifully. As the months drifted into years, the survivors began to notice changes in themselves that were gradual, almost imperceptible. Life had returned, in a sense, but it was a different life, a slower, quieter, and sometimes stranger one. The routines that had been novel, even amusing, became ingrained, part of an internal rhythm that replaced the external social structures now largely gone. Bernard still counted cobblestones, but now he noticed the way moss grew differently in winter versus summer, the subtle shift of shadow across a stone, or the faint differences in bird behavior. Every detail mattered because details were what remained. Isolation, it seems, has a peculiar effect on attention. Survivors became hyper-aware of minor events, the snapping of twigs underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, or the subtle groan of a house settling in the night. These observations, though mundane, became stories in themselves. Humans, left with little else, become meticulous chroniclers of life's small motions. The world was still full of wonder, but wonder was measured quietly, without audience, applause, or recognition. It is here that humor, quiet, sardonic, and understated, reasserted itself. Survivors noticed absurdities they had never paid attention to before. A stray dog that refused to enter a door, a misaligned chair that threatened a painstakingly arranged table, or the way wind rearranged loose papers in ways that seemed deliberate. They laughed softly, often only to themselves, and sometimes in shared, whispered acknowledgement with another cautious neighbor. The world had not changed, exactly. Humans had simply shifted the lens through which they observed it. Some survivors developed elaborate internal hierarchies and imaginary competitions. Who could arrange the most precise pile of firewood? Who could keep their garden perfectly symmetrical for the longest period? These were not contests of ego, exactly, but small, private assertions of skill and control. And naturally, they provided amusement, pride, and gentle rivalry in a world where larger challenges, disease, loss, societal collapse, were largely absent or already resolved. The long-term psychological effects were subtle but pervasive. Survivors became wary of noise, sudden movement, or unnecessary action. A misplaced object could disturb the delicate order of a day. A minor social interaction could provoke a disproportionate reaction, tempered only by politeness and the faint desire to preserve harmony. In essence, survivors had learned to treat the world itself as a fragile, slightly absurd organism requiring constant observation, gentle care, and measured interaction. Rituals became both practical and symbolic. Meals were prepared with meticulous care, often for one or two people, and eaten in quiet, meditative silence. Clothing was repaired and maintained obsessively, as if disorder in attire could invite disorder in life. Candles were lit for absent neighbors, objects arranged carefully to honor absent presences, and small, repeated gestures marked the passage of days. Even trivial routines, washing, sweeping, cataloging, were imbued with layered meaning, offering both comfort and subtle humor. Social interaction remained measured, polite, and sometimes absurdly cautious. Survivors who met after months apart would exchange greetings with bows, soft murmurs, and small, deliberate gestures. Conversations focused on trivial details, weather, birds, bread quality, because deeper or more personal topics felt too vulnerable, too risky in a world where social norms had collapsed. Politeness became a survival mechanism, and absurdity a quiet coping strategy. Animals continued to play a significant role. Cats, dogs, and birds were not merely companions, but participants in small rituals and routines. A cat perched on a carefully arranged pile of stones was both witness and critic. Birds, particularly those accustomed to Bernard, became auditors, companions, and occasionally, sources of minor amusement. Even the most mundane animal behavior could provoke reflection, amusement, or careful note-taking, forming a gentle rhythm to daily life. Interestingly, these post-plague towns developed their own subtle social rules. Respect for space, careful observation of routines, and tacit acknowledgement of each other's peculiarities became essential. Survivors learned that minor disruptions could ripple unexpectedly. A misplaced object, a slightly raised voice, or a sudden gesture could disturb harmony, provoke quiet exasperation, or inspire elaborate corrective rituals. In essence, civility became a carefully maintained, performative practice, quietly enforced, subtly policed, and lightly absurd. And yet, despite the quiet absurdity, a strange resilience emerged. Survivors demonstrated adaptability, creativity, and endurance. Bernard continued his cataloging, Madame M, her meticulous housekeeping, the retired shoemaker his stone arrangements, the wandering merchant his observations of wind and weather. Their lives, although small and circumscribed, were rich in detail, ritual, and quiet accomplishment. They found ways to endure, amuse themselves, and maintain a semblance of structure, despite the emptiness surrounding them. Humor remained understated but persistent. A crooked stone, a slightly missing spoon, or a misbehaving animal became sources of gentle exasperation and private amusement. Stories were told softly, often half seriously, half sardonic, as a way to process events, reinforce social bonds, or simply break the monotony of prolonged isolation. Life continued, not heroically, not dramatically, but persistently, and in this persistence, there was both dignity and subtle comedy. The slow, quiet passage of time allowed survivors to develop profound observation skills. They noticed patterns in nature, shifts in weather, and the habits of animals. They recorded these observations with care and dedication, in diaries, sketches, or mental notes. Their attentiveness was both practical and philosophical. Practical, in ensuring survival and comfort. Philosophical, in recognizing the fragility and resilience of life itself. In this gentle, sardonic reflection, we see that post-plague survival was not merely a matter of continuing to breathe. It was an exercise in observation, ritual, subtle humor, and patient adaptation. Survivors became chroniclers of absence, observers of minute detail, and participants in quietly absurd social microcosms. Their world was smaller, slower, and stranger, yet it persisted, with humans adapting in ways both practical and poetic. As the survivors settled into their quietly altered world, a subtle absurdity began to emerge. Life had returned, in a sense, but not as anyone had known it. Towns were smaller, households contained fewer people, and the routines of the old world, markets, festivals, neighborhood quarrels, had largely disappeared. In their place arose strange, patient routines and gentle, understated rituals, often peculiar in their precision, but quietly necessary. Bernard, for instance, began recording patterns not just of stones, birds, and shadows, but of other survivors' habits. He noted the exact time Madame M polished each object, the way the shoemaker arranged his stones, and how the wandering merchant adjusted his path depending on the wind. These observations were not meant to judge. They were a method of understanding a world that had lost much of its predictability. And, naturally, he narrated these observations softly to the birds, as if seeking validation from a particularly impartial audience. Madame M, meanwhile, had refined her domestic rituals to almost ceremonial levels. Tables were laid with invisible symmetry, cutlery aligned with the precision of a cathedral architect, and curtains adjusted hourly according to subtle light patterns. She spoke to cats as if they were minor courtiers, expecting their silent approval. And when they disapproved, by sitting on a table or swiping at a feather, she adjusted her arrangements with quiet resignation, as if negotiating with an occasionally obstinate advisor. Even small conflicts gained understated significance. Two survivors might debate, in hushed tones, whether a stray dog should be allowed to sleep in a particular corner of a barn. Gestures, size, and careful positioning of objects became the language of compromise. There were no loud arguments. Loudness was itself considered a minor threat, but subtle diplomacy and gentle negotiation became vital skills. These micropolitics, performed politely and persistently, formed the social framework of post-plague life. The humor in these routines was subtle, sardonic, and entirely understated. A crooked stone, a slightly misaligned spoon, or a bird landing in the wrong spot could provoke private exasperation and quiet amusement. Survivors developed small, private games and competitions. Who could maintain the neatest stack of firewood, who could catalog the most birds, who could arrange their few belongings with the most precision. These contests were performed quietly, without audience or applause, yet carried real importance in structuring the day and maintaining morale. As the seasons passed, survivors noticed patterns not only in objects, but in nature itself. Birds nested in predictable locations, shadows moved across windows with seasonal reliability, and the decay of wood and stone followed a quietly observable rhythm. Humans, once preoccupied with one another, now became attentive observers of the natural world, finding companionship and meaning in its steady, indifferent patterns. Even movement through the town became a carefully considered act. Streets were walked at deliberate speeds, doors opened with care, and gestures were measured to avoid disruption. In essence, every action became a ritual, blending necessity with subtle humor, observation, and gentle meditation. Life was slowed to a pace that allowed attention to flourish in ways previously unthinkable. The tilt of a roof tile, the pattern of lichen, the slight misalignment of a fence post. Animals remained essential participants. Cats were companions, judges, and occasional mischief makers. Dogs, when present, offered companionship, protection, and amusement. Birds served as auditors, critics, and sometimes unwitting collaborators in human rituals. Even the smallest creature could inspire reflection, gentle humor, or careful observation, forming an integral part of the rhythm of life. One begins to see the slow evolution of post-plague etiquette. Survivors became experts in subtle communication. A nod here, a gentle hand gesture there, a whispered word instead of a shouted command. These conventions were not formalized, but they were universally understood within the small community. And their practice, performed with care and patience, helped maintain a fragile harmony in the absence of traditional social structures. Rituals, both public and private, became central to life. Candles were lit for the absent, meals arranged with ceremonial precision, and objects handled with reverence. Small acts, placing a feather carefully on a table, arranging stones in a deliberate pattern, became meaningful markers of presence, acknowledgement, and memory. Humor and creativity, understated and gentle, remained intertwined with these rituals, allowing survivors to maintain both sanity and subtle enjoyment in their quiet, constrained world. Survivors also developed ways to measure time without bells, markets, or festivals. Observing the sun's shadow across windows, tracking the seasons through plant growth, and noting animal behaviors became methods of establishing a rhythm. Days were slow but structured, imbued with subtle order and quiet purpose. Even the repetition of minor tasks became an anchor, providing both comfort and amusement. And in all of this, the world itself, empty streets, abandoned buildings, quiet gardens, remained both stage and companion. Survivors interacted with spaces not merely as objects, but as participants in their lives, shaping routines, marking passages of time, and hosting rituals. They had become caretakers of absence, chroniclers of survival, and architects of subtle absurdity. Even when strangers arrived, a traveling merchant, a wandering traveler, or a distant relative, they were absorbed into these gentle, slow systems. Greetings were polite, observations were careful, and humor was understated. Newcomers became part of the rhythm gradually, learning the subtle codes of behavior, the rituals, and the quiet, sardonic ways in which these survivors had adapted. In essence, post-plague life was neither heroic nor dramatic. It was persistent, careful, humorous in understated ways, and deeply attuned to detail. Survivors like Bernard and Madame M exemplify the strange combination of patience, absurdity, and quiet resilience that defines life after catastrophic loss. They remind us that survival is not simply about living. It is about noticing, arranging, performing rituals, and occasionally laughing softly at the absurdities of human persistence. As survivors continued to inhabit quiet towns and half-empty villages, a peculiar social rhythm emerged. Not the kind dictated by mayors or laws, because those offices were largely irrelevant now, but a delicate, informal code that governed even the smallest interactions. People began to anticipate each other's routines, gestures, and even preferences, with a kind of attentiveness that borders on ritual. Take, for example, the case of two neighbors sharing a partially overgrown courtyard. One preferred to sweep at dawn, the other at mid-morning. Initially, this caused minor friction, dust from one sweep landing on a carefully arranged pattern of stones or plants belonging to the other. Over time, however, a tacit agreement emerged: early sweeps for one, mid-morning for the other, each respecting the invisible boundaries of attention. The result was a quiet, absurd choreography, neither written nor spoken, yet strictly adhered to. Small communal rituals evolved similarly. Survivors might gather at twilight for a silent walk through the square, nodding at abandoned doorways and empty shops. Candles were lit for those long gone, placed carefully in windows or on thresholds. Conversations, when they occurred, were hushed, mostly focused on trivial details: a particularly symmetrical leaf, a stray cat's choice of perch, or the oddity of a recently collapsed roof. These rituals reinforced a sense of community, not through words or grandeur, but through shared attention to small, persistent details. Yet the gentle absurdity persisted. A misplaced stone, a crooked chair, or a bird nesting in an inconvenient location could provoke minor debates, whispered complaints, or delicate corrections. These events were treated seriously, for they disrupted the fragile harmony that survivors had cultivated. And, naturally, humor emerged quietly, in sighs, smirks, or half-whispered comments about the relentless devotion to small, trivial tasks. In these subtle social systems, authority was almost entirely informal. The most meticulous, observant, or patient survivor became, by default, the arbiter of routines. Bernard, with his extensive cataloging of stones, birds, and shadows, often guided decisions about spatial arrangements and daily scheduling. Madame M, with her polished silver and carefully aligned furniture, subtly influenced domestic order. Leadership was not asserted verbally or aggressively. It was observed, respected, and occasionally challenged through minor acts of gentle rebellion, perhaps a slightly crooked spoon or a flower left out of place. Animals, as always, mediated and punctuated these dynamics. Cats continued to assert silent opinions, often testing human patience and adaptability. Dogs, when present, offered companionship and occasional comic relief. Birds served as both audience and confidants, their presence inspiring observation, amusement, and sometimes ritualized interaction. A pigeon perching on an inconvenient ledge might provoke a silent negotiation between humans, or a crow's sudden call might mark the beginning of a daily routine. In this delicate ecosystem, humans and animals coexisted in an understated, subtly absurd dance of survival. Food, too, became a source of gentle structure and quiet creativity. Without bustling markets or abundant resources, survivors adapted meals to the rhythms of availability and preservation. Bread was rationed carefully, vegetables grown in small plots tended meticulously, and any foraging was performed with attentiveness, observation, and a touch of humor. A partially spoiled fruit might be ceremoniously discarded, or repurposed in a small, imaginative ritual of survival. Meals were both sustenance and performance, blending necessity with order, ritual, and understated amusement. Even the measurement of time became an exercise in creativity. Days were structured not by clocks or town bells, but by natural cues: sunrise, shadow, the crowing of a rooster, or the behavior of animals. Weeks were marked by subtle changes in plant growth or bird migration. Seasons were observed with meticulous attention, and holidays, if they occurred, were quietly adapted. No processions, no songs, just simple acknowledgement of the passage of time and the rhythms of life. The humor of these adaptations was never loud, but persistent. Misplaced objects, misbehaving animals, and minor discrepancies in routines provided amusement, often shared with a nod, a smile, or a whispered comment. Laughter was soft, understated, and private, yet it remained a crucial thread in the fabric of survival. In a world largely emptied, subtle humor became a companion, a reminder that life continued, that absurdity persisted, and that humans could adapt creatively even in isolation. As survivors spent years in this quiet equilibrium, they developed subtle, informal hierarchies, routines, and codes of conduct that required observation, patience, and delicate negotiation. Each person had a role: cat feeder, stone arranger, garden keeper, firewood stacker, and the tacit respect for these roles maintained a fragile order. Small transgressions were corrected with gestures, sighs, or minor acts of rearrangement, never confrontation, but always with attention to detail. The result was a society that functioned quietly, absurdly, yet effectively in miniature. And through it all, the subtle, sardonic awareness persisted. Survivors were keenly aware of the absurdity of their routines, bowing to empty doorways, cataloging stones with care, arranging meals for one or two people. Yet, rather than despair, this awareness fostered gentle humor, resilience, and a quiet meditation on human adaptability. The tragedy of absence coexisted with the humor of persistence, creating a rhythm both soothing and slightly surreal. In this gently absurd world, survivors were both caretakers and performers, chroniclers and audience, rulers of small dominions of order and attention. Life continued, not heroically, but insistently, quietly, and often with a subtle smile at its own idiosyncrasies. The towns themselves, empty streets, abandoned shops, and overgrown courtyards, became a stage, silent but observant, for human ingenuity, ritual, and gentle humor. As survivors continued to inhabit quiet towns and half-empty villages, a peculiar social rhythm emerged. Not the kind dictated by mayors or laws, because those offices were largely irrelevant now, but a delicate, informal code that governed even the smallest interactions. People began to anticipate each other's routines, gestures, and even preferences, with the kind of attentiveness that borders on ritual. Take, for example, the case of two neighbors sharing a partially overgrown courtyard. One preferred to sweep at dawn, the other at mid-morning. Initially, this caused minor friction, dust from one sweep landing on a carefully arranged pattern of stones or plants belonging to the other. Over time, however, a tacit agreement emerged: early sweeps for one, mid-morning for the other, each respecting the invisible boundaries of attention. The result was a quiet, absurd choreography, neither written nor spoken, yet strictly adhered to. Small communal rituals evolved similarly. Survivors might gather at twilight for a silent walk through the square, nodding at abandoned doorways and empty shops. Candles were lit for those long gone, placed carefully in windows or on thresholds. Conversations, when they occurred, were hushed, mostly focused on trivial details: a particularly symmetrical leaf, a stray cat's choice of perch, or the oddity of a recently collapsed roof. These rituals reinforced a sense of community, not through words or grandeur, but through shared attention to small, persistent details. Yet the gentle absurdity persisted. A misplaced stone, a crooked chair, or a bird nesting in an inconvenient location could provoke minor debates, whispered complaints, or delicate corrections. These events were treated seriously, for they disrupted the fragile harmony that survivors had cultivated. And, naturally, humor emerged quietly, in sighs, smirks, or half-whispered comments about the relentless devotion to small, trivial tasks. In these subtle social systems, authority was almost entirely informal. The most meticulous, observant, or patient survivor became, by default, the arbiter of routines. Bernard, with his extensive cataloging of stones, birds, and shadows, often guided decisions about spatial arrangements and daily scheduling. Madame M, with her polished silver and carefully aligned furniture, subtly influenced domestic order. Leadership was not asserted verbally or aggressively. It was observed, respected, and occasionally challenged through minor acts of gentle rebellion, perhaps a slightly crooked spoon or a flower left out of place. Animals, as always, mediated and punctuated these dynamics. Cats continued to assert silent opinions, often testing human patience and adaptability. Dogs, when present, offered companionship and occasional comic relief. Birds served as both audience and confidants, their presence inspiring observation, amusement, and sometimes ritualized interaction. A pigeon perching on an inconvenient ledge might provoke a silent negotiation between humans, or a crow's sudden call might mark the beginning of a daily routine. In this delicate ecosystem, humans and animals coexisted in an understated, subtly absurd dance of survival. Food, too, became a source of gentle structure and quiet creativity. Without bustling markets or abundant resources, survivors adapted meals to the rhythms of availability and preservation. Bread was rationed carefully, vegetables grown in small plots tended meticulously, and any foraging was performed with attentiveness, observation, and a touch of humor. A partially spoiled fruit might be ceremoniously discarded, or repurposed in a small, imaginative ritual of survival. Meals were both sustenance and performance, blending necessity with order, ritual, and understated amusement. Even the measurement of time became an exercise in creativity. Days were structured not by clocks or town bells, but by natural cues: sunrise, shadow, the crowing of a rooster, or the behavior of animals. Weeks were marked by subtle changes in plant growth or bird migration. Seasons were observed with meticulous attention, and holidays, if they occurred, were quietly adapted. No processions, no songs, just simple acknowledgement of the passage of time and the rhythms of life. The humor of these adaptations was never loud, but persistent. Misplaced objects, misbehaving animals, and minor discrepancies in routines provided amusement, often shared with a nod, a smile, or a whispered comment. Laughter was soft, understated, and private, yet it remained a crucial thread in the fabric of survival. In a world largely emptied, subtle humor became a companion, a reminder that life continued, that absurdity persisted, and that humans could adapt creatively even in isolation. As survivors spent years in this quiet equilibrium, they developed subtle, informal hierarchies, routines, and codes of conduct that required observation, patience, and delicate negotiation. Each person had a role: cat feeder, stone arranger, garden keeper, firewood stacker, and the tacit respect for these roles maintained a fragile order. Small transgressions were corrected with gestures, sighs, or minor acts of rearrangement, never confrontation, but always with attention to detail. The result was a society that functioned quietly, absurdly, yet effectively in miniature. And through it all, the subtle, sardonic awareness persisted. Survivors were keenly aware of the absurdity of their routines, bowing to empty doorways, cataloging stones with care, arranging meals for one or two people. Yet, rather than despair, this awareness fostered gentle humor, resilience, and a quiet meditation on human adaptability. The tragedy of absence coexisted with the humor of persistence, creating a rhythm both soothing and slightly surreal. In this gently absurd world, survivors were both caretakers and performers, chroniclers and audience, rulers of small dominions of order and attention. Life continued, not heroically, but insistently, quietly, and often with a subtle smile at its own idiosyncrasies. The towns themselves, empty streets, abandoned shops, and overgrown courtyards became a stage, silent but observant, for human ingenuity, ritual, and gentle humor. As years passed, the quiet towns and half-empty villages slowly became places of subtle memory. Survivors like Bernard and Madame M had woven themselves into the rhythm of absence, their days measured by shadows, bird songs, and the meticulous arrangement of stones, silver, and garden plots. Yet even in this slow, deliberate existence, there lingered echoes of the wider world, particularly its history of human absurdity, which seemed oddly comforting. It is fascinating, though not entirely surprising, how humans carry eccentricity across time. The very habits of these survivors, careful cataloging, ritualized attention, whimsical games, mirror the strange obsessions of the elites of earlier centuries. Monarchs, nobles, and courtiers often dedicated themselves to minutiae, whether it was the precise folding of garments, the arrangement of feasts, or the obsessive recording of genealogies. In a world emptied by plague, the survivors unknowingly mirrored these behaviors, as if centuries of aristocratic eccentricity had been quietly passed down to anyone left standing. Consider a distant analogy. The eccentric kings of Europe, known for their obsession with cleanliness, symmetry, or obsessive record-keeping. Survivors like Madame M polished silver with near-royal devotion, while Bernard catalogued stones and birds with the patience of a minor prince auditing his accounts. In these small, private rituals, one can see a faint echo of courtly obsession, but stripped of grandeur and pomp. The absurdity is quieter, personal, and strangely comforting, a reminder that human obsession does not require wealth or power, merely time, attention, and survival. The social dynamics of survivors also mirrored aristocratic absurdities. Informal hierarchies emerged. The meticulous stone arranger commanded quiet respect, much as a court chamberlain might oversee minor affairs. Rituals, lighting candles, arranging meals, observing nature, resembled, in miniature, the ceremonial codes of royal households. And humor, subtle and sardonic, threaded through these practices, echoing the private amusement of nobles who observed their own rituals with a mix of reverence and irony. Animals, too, played analogous roles. In royal courts, dogs and cats often served as companions, symbols of status, or sources of minor amusement. In the post-plague towns, they served similar functions, mediating disputes, inspiring observation, and providing quiet companionship. Birds, in particular, became Bernard's silent advisors, not unlike the falcons or exotic birds kept by nobles as living ornaments of order and control. The parallel is striking and gently humorous. The same patterns emerge whether one rules a kingdom or survives in a half-empty village. It is worth noting that the subtle absurdities of survival often intersected with creativity. Without markets or schools, survivors invented games, rituals, and practices that were, in their own way, elaborate performances. Chess played alone became a drama of voices and personalities. Stones arranged geometrically became a silent exhibition of taste and precision. Meals were prepared ceremoniously, even when consumed by one person, echoing the intricate feasts of historical elites. Life, stripped of audience and consequence, became performance, humor, and meditation simultaneously. Even minor conflicts were reminiscent of courtly intrigue. Disputes over the arrangement of objects, placement of animals, or timing of daily routines resembled, in their miniature way, the gentle rivalries of noble households. There were no duels, no dramatic accusations, just subtle negotiation, observation, and occasionally quiet, sardonic amusement at the intensity invested in minor matters. Humans, it seems, bring intrigue wherever they go, even to abandoned villages. Over time, survivors became not just participants in daily life, but chroniclers of it. Diaries, sketches, and mental cataloging preserved patterns, rituals, and minor events. These records were often humorous, subtly ironic, and deeply attentive to detail. In a world largely emptied, recording small occurrences became both necessity and delight, much as court historians might chronicle trivial daily affairs, family disputes, or minor ceremonial mishaps. The rhythm of life, slow and precise, cultivated patience, observation, and resilience. Yet subtle absurdities remained ever present. A crooked stone, a missing feather, or a misbehaving animal could provoke careful correction, quiet exasperation, or gentle amusement. Rituals were repeated with devotion, often with private commentary, whispered jokes, or sardonic reflection. The survivors, in their quiet adaptation, embodied a peculiar mixture of endurance, creativity, and understated humor, a microcosm of human eccentricity preserved in a slow-motion world. It is in this convergence of isolation, observation, and subtle absurdity that the narrative gently begins to loop back to the broader history of human folly. The patterns of obsessive behavior, ceremonial care, and minor rivalry in post-plague towns foreshadow the eccentricities of kings, queens, and nobles. Across time, humans respond to absence, uncertainty, and mortality with careful routines, rituals, and humor. Whether in a half-empty village or a palace, the impulse is the same: to impose order, create meaning, and quietly amuse oneself amid the relentless persistence of life. And so, as the survivors continued their careful routines, cataloging, polishing, observing, and occasionally laughing softly at minor absurdities, they became, in miniature, living echoes of aristocratic eccentricity. The parallel is gentle, ironic, and strangely reassuring. Humanity endures, not only by surviving catastrophe, but by cultivating ritual, humor, and attention to the smallest details, whether in a palace or a deserted village. Now that we have walked softly through the quiet streets of post-plague towns, observing the meticulous routines, subtle humor, and gentle absurdities of survival, it is worth noticing the uncanny parallels with historical elites. Those long-dead kings and queens, with their tiny obsessions, petty rivalries, and curious rituals, might seem distant or absurdly distant, but in many ways, they were not so different from Bernard, Madame M., or the quiet herbalist who tended a single plot of herbs. Consider the peculiar habits of royals, often recorded with fascination, horror, or mild exasperation by court chroniclers. Kings obsessed over the alignment of their furniture, queens demanded strict cataloging of every household item, and entire dynasties devoted themselves to rituals whose logic was visible only to themselves. In many ways, these obsessions echo the meticulous cataloging of stones, the careful alignment of silver, and the quiet observation of birds we have witnessed among our survivors. The scale and grandeur differ, of course, but the underlying impulse, to create order, find meaning, and amuse oneself amid life's uncertainty, is remarkably consistent. Take, for instance, the curious case of Charles VI of France, Charles the Mad. At times he believed himself made of glass, insisting on walking carefully to avoid shattering. Imagine Bernard's careful stone arranging amplified to royal absurdity. Or think of Maria I of Portugal, who refused to touch or eat anything that had not been ceremoniously inspected by attendants, echoing Madame M's meticulous polishing and silent approval from cats. These eccentricities are not random. They are extensions of human attempts to impose structure and meaning on an uncertain world. Inbreeding, fragile bloodlines, and dynastic obsession offer further parallels. Just as survivors in empty towns adapted creatively to ensure continuity and order, royal families sometimes pursued continuity through extreme, often disastrous measures. Marriages between cousins, repeated alliances within narrow dynasties, and obsessive preservation of bloodlines were efforts to maintain control, even if the results were comically unfortunate. One might almost imagine a half-empty village of survivors attempting similar feats, carefully pairing chickens or rationing seeds according to imagined dynastic rules, except with the stakes reduced to minor domestic inconvenience rather than international politics. Royal households, like survivor communities, were also microcosms of subtle social negotiation. Courtiers maneuvered quietly for influence, attendants observed and corrected minor errors, and absurd rituals provided both entertainment and subtle reinforcement of hierarchy. In the deserted village, the shoemaker's authority over stone arrangement, Bernard's command of bird observation, and Madame Ms. ceremonial care of silver performed the same function, establishing order, mediating disputes, and asserting competence in a miniature, quiet court. The humor in these parallels is understated but persistent. Just as a king might obsess over the angle of a window or the precise hue of a curtain, a survivor might fuss over a crooked stone or a misaligned spoon. Both actions are absurd, trivial, and highly human. Both are attempts to impose meaning on a world that is indifferent, unpredictable, or partially emptied. Both involve attention, patience, and a measure of quiet amusement. Ritual, too, threads gently through both worlds. Survivors light candles, align objects, and observe minute patterns in nature. Royals conducted elaborate ceremonies, maintained meticulous records, and oversaw daily routines with almost obsessive care. The scale differs, but the underlying human impulse to ritualize life, create narrative, and attend to the smallest details is consistent. In fact, one could argue that the quiet absurdities of plague survivors are simply aristocratic eccentricity reduced to essentials, stripped of ceremony, wealth, and consequence. Even subtle hierarchies and minor conflicts find their echoes. A courtier disagreeing about a chair placement or the proper way to fold a sleeve mirrors a survivor debating the arrangement of stones or the timing of sweeping. Authority is informal, derived from competence, observation, or ritual expertise. Disputes are resolved quietly, often with subtle gestures or gentle corrections, and humor threads through both worlds in understated, ironic ways. And, naturally, animals continue to matter. In royal courts, dogs, cats, and birds were companions, symbols of status, or sources of minor amusement. In the half-empty village, they remain participants, observers, and sources of gentle comedy. Their presence reminds humans that even in isolation, attention, care, and observation remain meaningful. A cat swiping at a feather or a bird perching on a stone may provoke private exasperation, but it also sustains ritual, humor, and engagement with the environment, a subtle microcosm of courtly life. Through this lens, we see that survival, eccentricity, and the subtle absurdity of human behavior are deeply intertwined. Whether in a post-plague village or a palace filled with courtiers, humans respond to uncertainty, absence, and mortality with careful observation, ritualized routines, and understated humor. They impose order, cultivate meaning, and quietly amuse themselves. The details, the crooked stone, the polished spoon, the ceremonial bow, are as important to a small survivor as the precise angle of a window or the careful folding of royal garments. It is in these small, persistent behaviors that both worlds converge. The quiet persistence of plague survivors mirrors the gentle absurdities of kings, queens, and nobles. Their routines, rituals, and minor competitions reveal a common human thread: the need for structure, the impulse to record and catalog, and the subtle joy of private amusement. Absence and uncertainty may dominate the landscape, but attention, observation, and humor endure. And so, as our survivors continue their careful routines, cataloging, polishing, observing, and gently negotiating minor disputes, they echo the long-dead monarchs who obsessed over trivialities, indulged in ritual, and preserved fragile hierarchies. Life continues, quietly, persistently, absurdly, and beautifully, whether in the empty streets of a plague-stricken village or the echoing halls of a royal palace. As we move from the quiet, meticulous world of plague survivors to the far more extravagant, yet oddly similar, world of historical monarchs, we find a curious pattern. The eccentricity, obsession with detail, and subtle absurdity that once sustained a small village of survivors manifests grandly in royal courts. Only now, instead of a crooked stone or a misaligned spoon, it might be a royal decree concerning the exact number of steps in a garden path, or the proper hue of a tablecloth for a banquet. Inbred monarchs, in particular, offer a fascinating window into human obsession with order, lineage, and control, albeit taken to sometimes disastrous extremes. Consider the Habsburgs, whose intermarriages over generations created famously protruding jaws, fragile health, and occasional mental instability. Charles II of Spain, for instance, inherited generations of carefully curated genetics and ended up with a body and mind more peculiar than practical, earning the gentle moniker the Bewitched. One cannot help but see in him echoes of our survivors, a careful observer of small routines, constrained by circumstance, and surviving in a world designed long before he had any say. The humor here is subtle but persistent. Charles II, while incapable of ruling effectively due to infirmity, nonetheless maintained court rituals, observed protocol, and became a living testament to the consequences of excessive concern with purity of blood. One imagines him quietly adjusting the folds of his robes or the arrangement of his dining implements, not unlike Madame M, polishing silver or Bernard aligning stones, though with dramatically higher stakes. The absurdity is amplified by scale, yet the underlying human impulse is identical: control, ritual, and private amusement in a fragile and uncertain world. Other royal families followed similar patterns. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, obsessed over time, appearances, and ceremonial precision, enforcing strict schedules and dress codes upon his court. One can imagine him as a grand-scale Bernard, counting courtiers instead of stones, cataloging attire instead of silver, and maintaining order through ritualized observation. Petty disputes in court mirrored the minor conflicts of our village survivors. Disagreements over seating, placement of objects, or timing of rituals became significant, even if ultimately inconsequential. Dynastic inbreeding produced other curious consequences. Not merely physical deformities or fragile health, but also eccentric habits, ritualized behaviors, and idiosyncratic social codes. In some families, marriages were arranged to preserve bloodlines despite obvious warning signs. Spouses, often unwilling or unfit, were ceremoniously paired to maintain appearances and perceived order. The humor, as usual, is subtle. Humans, in their persistent attempt to create continuity and structure, often produce results that are both tragic and absurd in equal measure. These patterns extend to the minor behaviors and daily routines of monarchs. A queen might refuse to touch objects not properly sanitized, insist on elaborate daily walks, or demand that attendants follow precise choreographies when serving meals. A king might maintain a miniature army of advisors to supervise trivial matters, issuing decrees that seem unnecessary to anyone outside the court. In essence, courts became structured microcosms of obsession, ritual, and quiet absurdity, echoing the rhythms of the post-plague village, but in a grander, more visible form. The subtle humor of these behaviors is amplified by the contrast between intent and effect. A monarch may intend absolute control and dignity, yet produce comedy through rigidity, obsession, or eccentricity. Similarly, our plague survivors intended quiet order and continuity, yet produced subtle amusement through overattention, misalignment, or imaginative rituals. In both cases, humans assert themselves over circumstance, finding security, meaning, and amusement in repetition and precision. Animals, naturally, appear here as well. Royal courts kept dogs, cats, falcons, and exotic birds, each carefully observed, trained, and incorporated into rituals of hierarchy. In villages, survivors relied on similar creatures, though less ceremoniously. Birds, cats, and dogs remain companions, critics, and participants in human absurdity, regardless of palace walls or empty streets. The impulse to include them in rituals, observe behavior, and derive amusement is a consistent thread across centuries and circumstances. Even minor social hierarchies and petty disputes echo familiar patterns. Courtiers maneuvered for influence over seating arrangements, garden paths, or ceremonial timing. Similarly, in villages, survivors negotiated over stone arrangements, sweeping schedules, and animal behavior. Authority derives from competence, patience, or ritual expertise, and disputes are resolved quietly, politely, and often with understated sardonic amusement. Humans, whether in a palace or a half-empty village, cannot resist micropolitics. Through this gentle comparison, one can see a continuous thread. Human beings, when confronted with uncertainty, mortality, or the need for order, develop elaborate routines, rituals, and subtle absurdities. Whether in a post-plague village or a royal court, survival, social, emotional, or political, depends on attention, structure, and occasional private amusement. Eccentricity is not merely tolerated, it is essential, providing stability, humor, and a gentle reminder of persistence amid fragility. And so, the lives of inbred monarchs, obsessively precise queens, and eccentric kings mirror, on a larger scale, the quiet, measured, absurdly meticulous lives of plague survivors. Both groups, in their respective contexts, demonstrate the same impulses: to observe, catalog, control, and amuse oneself in a world that is often indifferent, unpredictable, and fundamentally absurd. As we settle further into the world of eccentric monarchs, it becomes clear that human obsession with minutiae is not limited to isolated oddities. It can dominate entire dynasties. Inbred families, fragile bloodlines, and rigid adherence to ritual-produced outcomes both tragic and gently absurd, reminding us, in a drowsy way, that human nature rarely changes, regardless of wealth, status, or catastrophe. Take the Habsburgs again, whose careful obsession with marrying cousins produced the famous Habsburg jaw and other peculiarities. Charles II of Spain, a man whose health, speech, and mobility were profoundly compromised, nonetheless maintained ceremonial authority. He insisted on daily routines, attended audiences in precise costume, and expected court attendants to observe every detail of propriety. One cannot help but imagine Bernard or Madame M. arranging stones or silverware, amplified to a palace of hundreds, control, ritual, and subtle humor scaled up for the theater of royalty. Similarly, the Ptolemies of Egypt engaged in repeated sibling marriages to preserve dynastic continuity. Cleopatra's family, despite brilliance in politics and culture, often struggled with the consequences of their inbreeding, fragile health, erratic behavior, and occasional internal conflict. The humor is not cruel, exactly, but quietly sardonic. Human beings, in their devotion to perceived order and stability, often produce outcomes that are absurd in hindsight, but intensely serious in the moment. Even minor, everyday obsessions in royal households become magnified examples of human eccentricity. Louis XIV, the Sun King, maintained a court schedule so meticulous that every meal, audience, and stroll through Versailles was orchestrated down to the minute. One can imagine him quietly adjusting the placement of a candlestick or instructing a courtier on the proper angle of a curtain, absurd if viewed from afar, yet logical in the internal logic of courtly life. This mirrors our survivors' meticulous routines, only on a grander, more theatrical scale. Petty rivalries also magnify human absurdity. Sibling disputes, competition for court favor, and subtle manipulation of attendants were all part of palace life, echoing the small, measured negotiations among survivors in deserted villages. Who gets the better corner of a courtyard? Who may sweep first? Which bird may perch on which ledge? These are echoes of the same human desire to assert competence, preserve order, and negotiate status in tiny increments. The stakes are different, but the psychology is familiar. Odd habits, too, proliferated. Queen Christina of Sweden, for example, rejected conventional female attire, insisted on dressing as a man, and surrounded herself with intellectuals and philosophers rather than courtly attendants. Her eccentricity, though socially provocative, is reminiscent of the playful inventiveness of survivors inventing rituals or games in empty streets. Both display human ingenuity and individuality in response to circumstance, an imaginative assertion of order and personality in constrained conditions. Even tragedy takes on a quietly absurd dimension in dynastic history. Inbred lineages, fragile heirs, and obsessive rituals often led to minor catastrophes, children too sickly to rule, marriages that produced predictable physical deformities, or ceremonial observances that required extraordinary attention to detail. From a distance, these events are almost humorous in their predictability. Up close, however, They are gentle reminders of the limits of human control and the persistent human tendency to impose order, even when consequences are inconvenient. Animals, predictably, remain consistent companions in both contexts. Falcons, dogs, cats, and exotic birds served multiple functions in royal courts: amusement, status symbols, and sometimes subtle participants in court rituals. Similarly, cats and birds in villages provided companionship, mediators of minor disputes, and observers of ritual. Across centuries and contexts, humans integrate animals into patterns of attention, control, and amusement. Their presence emphasizes both continuity and absurdity. We also see the subtle interplay of humor and ritual in dynasties. Kings, queens, and courtiers often maintained rituals for their own amusement, as displays of power or to enforce social cohesion. These rituals, though occasionally bizarre to outside observers, were internally logical and carried great personal significance. Survivors in deserted towns, similarly, develop private rituals, arranging stones, polishing silver, or cataloging birds, to maintain structure, continuity, and private delight. Humor remains understated, sardonic, and intimate, highlighting the universality of these impulses. Ultimately, the lesson drifts quietly into place. Whether in empty villages or royal palaces, human beings respond to uncertainty, mortality, and social complexity by creating structure, ritual, and subtle amusements. Petty obsessions, meticulous routines, and quiet humor are not failures. They are adaptations, deeply embedded in the human psyche. The scale may vary, but the underlying psychology is consistent across centuries and circumstances. Even as we watch the fragile lineages, eccentric monarchs, and elaborate dynasties, one cannot help but feel a gentle sympathy for these characters. They were, like Bernard, Madame M., and the other survivors, attempting to navigate fragile, unpredictable worlds through attention, ritual, and understated humor. Their absurdities are human, persistent, and quietly enduring, reminders that eccentricity is not a flaw, but a survival strategy, whether in palace corridors or deserted village streets. If dynastic obsession is a human constant, then royal marriages are the perfect illustration. Marrying cousins, siblings, or distant relatives might have seemed like a practical solution to maintain power, bloodline, or territory. In practice, it often produced bizarre outcomes: fragile heirs, eccentric personalities, or the occasional political disaster. One cannot help but notice the subtle comedy of it all, the quiet absurdity amplified by gold, velvet, and ceremonial gravity. Take the Habsburgs once again. Charles II of Spain inherited generations of carefully controlled genetics, producing a body that struggled with even basic function. Yet, the court continued to celebrate ceremony, ritual, and appearances. One imagines a slightly comedic tableau: attendants fussing over a king who cannot walk without difficulty, correcting minor errors with gentle exasperation, and remaining polite while the king himself adjusted to his own absurd constraints. The underlying human impulse, control, attention, and private amusement, is clear, even if the scale is far larger than our post-plague villagers stacking stones or cataloging birds. Dynastic marriages elsewhere were equally eccentric. In Portugal, Maria I married her uncle, an arrangement intended to preserve royal bloodlines. The marriage produced children, but also a fragile court of sanity, where eccentricity and mental instability became almost expected. Similarly, the Ptolemies married siblings repeatedly, producing brilliant yet often unpredictable rulers. The humor, understated and sardonic, comes from the mismatch between human intention and actual outcome, carefully arranged unions intended to secure continuity, resulting instead in fragility, absurdity, and occasional quiet catastrophe. Even minor, everyday royal habits mirror this gentle absurdity. Queens insisting on precise arrangements of household items, kings obsessed over attire or posture, and courtiers subtly competing for status create a world in which minor details carry immense importance. Compare this to a survivor carefully polishing a spoon, aligning a stone pile, or cataloging a bird. Control, observation, and humor manifest differently, but the psychological pattern remains consistent. Humans, it seems, are endlessly fascinated by minutiae when stakes feel significant, whether those stakes are political power or domestic order. Some marriages resulted in particularly unusual consequences. Consider the intermarried European families whose children suffered from deformities or illness, producing heirs who could not rule effectively. The court's response was ceremonial perseverance, maintaining appearances and continuity despite obvious dysfunction. Again, we see a parallel to survivors negotiating minor routines, maintaining small rituals, and observing protocols, even in the face of absurdity. Scale differs, but persistence, observation, and understated humor are shared traits. Minor rivalries and petty disputes were also common. Who would sit where at a banquet? Which sibling might influence ceremonial timing? Who could assert authority over garden arrangements? These small conflicts, often inconsequential to outsiders, carried weight internally, just as a misaligned stone or a crooked feather might provoke quiet exasperation among survivors. Authority and respect are subtly negotiated, observed, and maintained, producing a social ecosystem rich with humor and ritual, whether in a palace or a deserted village. Animals, predictably, played symbolic and practical roles. Royal dogs, cats, and birds were companions, symbols of status, and participants in subtle courtly games. In post-plague villages, animals fulfilled similar roles, mediating disputes, inspiring observation, and providing amusement. Across time and circumstance, humans incorporate animals into daily life, rituals, and subtle displays of confidence. The humor and absurdity are quietly consistent, whether observing a pigeon perched on a palace window or a cat atop a stack of carefully arranged stones. Even the most dramatic royal failures are, in hindsight, subtly humorous. Mismanaged marriages, fragile heirs, and ceremonial rigidity produce consequences that are tragic only in theory. In practice, they are exercises in human eccentricity. Similarly, survivors maintaining routines, observing nature, and enforcing minor hierarchies produce quietly absurd narratives in miniature. Both cases reveal persistence, creativity, and attention to detail as central to human behavior, with humor emerging naturally from the collision of intent and outcome. In observing these dynastic absurdities, one begins to see the gentle rhythm of history. Humans obsess, ritualize, and amuse themselves, whether the stakes are global or local. They negotiate hierarchy, maintain private rituals, and subtly assert authority. They integrate animals, patterns, and small pleasures into daily life. And in every instance, the absurdity is tempered by patience, observation, and understated humor, a consistent thread connecting empty village streets to gilded palace halls. Ultimately, royal marriages, like survivor routines, are less about triumph than persistence. They reveal the continuity of human eccentricity, the subtle humor of intention meeting reality, and the quiet joy of ritualized observation. From half-empty courtyards to palace corridors, humans navigate uncertainty through meticulous attention, gentle absurdity, and ongoing negotiation with the world around them.